Okay.
Don't make Kitty angry by not answering.
Well, I tell you, you almost were a little too fast today. It's Basil. Yeah, I'm going to put
I figured.
What who you been talking to? Says he's been on the phone all day, talking to Trump's 12 cats. Because he's been getting phone calls from them, and they're just like they're leaving little tidbits of joy in Donald and Melania's shoes while they're away from the penthouse at Trump Tower. They're apparently leaving Basil some tidbits too, and yeah, okay, I'll mention it. He wants me to mention that Basil has been talking to Trump's 12 cats. All 12 of his cats are named Whitey. It's simple. It's because it's simplicity for Trump. He doesn't have to remember 12 names. He could just call out Whitey, and he gets all 12 of them, answer them at the same time. Okay. We got it up on the screen. We've got to do the show now, but we'll put a word in for Basil Buddha Cat presents! Exclamation point. Okay. I'll see you Friday night for the show. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. Tonight we have a return visit from good friend Nina Sherwood, who was at a very interesting meeting this weekend regarding the Democratic Party. I'm going to let her do all the explaining, and I'm going to ask questions about it. Nina, do some splaining.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So we had a roundtable discussion on whether or not the Democratic Party can be reformed. And I think that this is a really important question given the events of the last 18 months with the Democratic primary, with Hillary Clinton losing in the general election. I think a lot of people in this country are really looking for another message. They're looking for a wider scope that includes more rights for workers, more environmental protections, things like that, and neither party is really representing those ideals to the extent that most people want them to. So given what happened in the primary with Bernie Sanders, it is pertinent that we ask this question: is the Democratic Party the vehicle that is going to get us the progressive change that we're looking for? And it's a very difficult question. It's one I've been struggling with for a long time. I went to the convention as a delegate for Bernie Sanders, and that was really a mental evolution for me on a lot of different levels. And leaving,
we were there, but we were on the outside. But you were actually there in the convention center. Okay.
Yeah, I was on the outside too.
I know you were there because we helped vote you in as one of our delegates.
And thank you so much for that. And that is actually, that caucus, that voting process, is one of the first things on the panel that I talked about. So just an overview of the event. There was 3 speakers. One was Al Simon, and he is a progressive from Connecticut, and he was also a Bernie delegate. That's where I met him. And he was of the opinion that the only way to get the changes that we want politically in our society would be to go through the Democratic Party, to infiltrate it and then change the party from within. And then there was Dan Bell of Socialist Action, who argued that the Democratic Party hasn't really ever been a party of the people or of labor, and that we need a third party and a different route than the Democratic Party. And then I was kind of in the middle as a Bernie Sanders delegate and as somebody who's still working within the Democratic Party, but ultimately, I'm kind of stuck between the two. I'm not exactly convinced that we can change the party from within inside, but I'm also not convinced that we can get the change that we need by going third party.
Well, good friend Henry Pietras, who just happens to be here in the audience today.
Fantastic guy.
He's very much of the same mind in terms of being an outsider and being an insider. The notion of you work within the party, but at the same time, keep in mind the option of if the party doesn't come through and doesn't act like the party that we expect them to act like, then we hold that option available. And actually, a couple of weeks ago, when Bernie Sanders was on talking, I think it was the talk he had with Ted Cruz. I think it was. He mentioned that, it was when he was on with Elizabeth Edwards a few weeks ago. And thank you, Elizabeth Warren. Thank you, Henry. Elizabeth Warren, and his words to the Democratic Party were essentially, we progressives are going where we're going. If the Democratic Party insiders want to come along with us, you're welcome, come along. Otherwise, and that's the dangling participle, so to speak. Continue.
And I mean, that's kind of where I'm at. I've stopped with just blindly following any party or any individual politician. So just because someone is running in the Democratic Party doesn't mean that I necessarily support them. They have to, be campaigning and pushing for a certain set of issues. And if they're not, that doesn't mean that I'm for the Republican or for the person on the other side. It just means that I'm not going to go and knock doors. I'm not going to make phone calls. And I'm not going to support that person if they don't meet a basic set of principles that, that I hold most dear. And I think as Americans, we constantly, everyone's like, oh, all of our politicians suck. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of that has to do with money. Money in our electoral process. But I think that there is some individual responsibility attached to that, in the sense that we're constantly, and this term has been used so many times, voting for the lesser of two evils, and also, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I have a serious problem with both of those statements and both of those arguments, because I think that we've gotten so far to the right because we're consistently allowing the goalposts to get moved. We're consistently saying, okay, I'm going to vote for X person simply because they're slightly better than the right-wing Republican. And so it always goes more right, and the person we support always goes more to the right. And we end up with corporatist politicians running the party. And so part of that is our fault. Whereas if back decades ago, we said, we're not going to support a candidate like that, regardless of who their opponent was. The party, the Democratic Party, would have figured out a long time ago that the people aren't just going to go along because the Republicans are so bad. And so I think that we need to start finding out what are our lines that are too dear to cross, so that we can go forward with meaning and passion and dedication to issues, as opposed to just being so frightened all the time. We've trained the Democratic Party to think that we can, we don't really have to stand for much because we're going to get the votes anyways, because the right-wing boogeyman is so horrible. And they are horrible. But our candidate has consistently gotten closer to that. So I think we need to start taking individual responsibility and stop, just voting for people that are not, really holding to our core values.
Good point, and we all have time on our hands, the time when we're not doing important things like watching America's Most Wanted or whatever like that. But we have limited time on our hands to spend knocking on doors, making phone calls, doing the things that volunteers do for campaigns, things that go above and beyond actually just going and pulling the lever or writing in the name on Election Day. We've got limited time. So we have to pick and choose those candidates that are nearest and dearest to our hearts when we spend that time. We're not going to just go willy-nilly around the countryside for somebody that we really have to hold our nose when we talk about it. When I think back to 2004, John Kerry, where the Howard Dean supporters followed behind Howard. Howard had made the pledge that if John Kerry were the candidate, Howard Dean would support him 100%. I appreciate that. He said it. He stuck to it. Very much the same way that Bernie Sanders did in 2016, where he made the promise that if Hillary Clinton were the nominee, he would support her 100%. And he did.
Right.
And I'm fine with that because he said he was going to. But that doesn't mean that the rest of us are obligated. We didn't make that promise. So in 2004, we gave a little bit of effort to John Kerry's presidential nomination. Likewise, we gave, I didn't give any, but some people, some Bernie supporters gave a little time to helping Hillary Clinton in her futile attempt to do anything other than alienate people by what she called Trump supporters deplorables, which was about the most idiotic thing she could have said, because she lost everybody that were Trump supporters that might have considered voting for her each step of the way, where Trump would say one horrible thing after the next. He never lost any of those people because Clinton had already identified them as all deplorables.
Right.
Continue.
So, yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. You know, a lot of people talk about that the 2016 presidential election was a change election. And well, what does that mean? We talk about it and we hear it in passing, but do we ever stop and really think about that? And the reality is that all of our politicians, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, have really left the people behind, okay? The vast majority of Americans want health care that they don't have to worry about losing their house or their mortgage because they come down with cancer. And the vast majority of Americans are against war. And the vast majority of Americans want clean air and clean water and want a better life for their children and want to move forward in a moral and just way into the future with vision and purpose. And unfortunately, both parties are handcuffed by the money that they take and by the institutional system that they perpetuate. Both parties don't represent that. And that's why, you know, we're, as Americans, we're like, oh, American citizens, they don't vote. And they, you know, if we have a general election for president where 50% of Americans vote, everyone's like, oh my God, it's a miracle. So many people voted. The reality is we need to be ashamed of ourselves. And, you know, 50%, you know, we pride ourselves in being democracy. And we give one person a vote, one man, one vote, and we even go as far as to spread that violently to other countries. And yet here, people don't even see the purpose in voting often. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that neither party is really, truly speaking to the people, the vast majority of people in this country, on those issues. And so what we talked about on Friday is the Democratic Party a place where this large swath of Americans who are looking for a political vehicle to push, you know, an agenda through, is the Democratic Party going to be that? And it was, you know, it was a long discussion and it was a good one. And I think that people across the country need to be having this discussion if we're going to move forward in any effective way.
You mentioned morals and values, and that's exactly what we need to talk about, because when we talk about morals and values, I think it's safe to say that most Americans are on the same page as us. We all have, no matter what religion or non-religion, or no matter where we are on the scale of religion, or not even, or agnostics, atheists, all of us share essential moral and ethical values. We know the difference between right and wrong. We understand the difference between good and bad. We understand that people shouldn't be left out and shouldn't be thrown into the gutter by either party, and they see that happening really, in fact, from both parties.
Well, yeah. Right. And so at the panel, Al Simon spoke first. He was the Bernie delegate, and he was talking about how the Democratic Party already has ballot access. It has an infrastructure to produce candidates. And so that is the only way that we're going to be able to really produce progressive change. We have to go in masse and infiltrate that system because it's already, the system is already there, and take it over and create the progressive party that we want. And Dan Bell talked about how the Democratic Party has really let the laborers and the vast majority of the middle class and the poor down in this country over and over again. You know, the Democratic Party has perpetuated a lot of wars, has started a lot of wars despite public opinion. And he brought up the fact that the first use of the military during World War II was to put strikers back to work, and that was labor strikes. Put those strikers back to work, and that was FDR. You know, and that's like FDR's policies and the New Deal is something that, you know, I think as progressives we look at that and we say, look what we could do. Look how far we did get.
Yeah.
And then to see FDR be the person to forcefully and violently use the military to push people back to work for the war machine, we need to look at the party and say, even in our history, even our heroes in the Democratic Party, in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, have to some extent let us down. And is that the party, is that the place that is going to get us where we want to go?
I had a good conversation today with one of my at my real estate office with one of the other realtors there, and we were trying to figure out whether any of America's wars have been moral and just. And we came to the conclusion that if there were, it probably was World War II. Certainly every war since World War II has not been about right and wrong.
Certainly not.
Korea, no.
No.
Vietnam, nope.
Definitely not.
Invasion and occupation of Iraq, all the deposing of freely elected leaders in other countries and replacing them with dictatorships, including putting Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
And taking him out.
Deposing the government in Iran and putting in the Shah. Not the Shah, but the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was forced out by, you know, all these things. But certainly World War II, I think it's safe to say, there was some true morality behind that. And even folks like me that are pacifists understand that when you're attacked and when other people that are good people are attacked, then sometimes you have to step in and use military force. Much as it grates me as a pacifist, but I understand it. But continue with this with a line about continue with talking about the New Deal and some of the things that Roosevelt did that were good things that we would like to replicate or continue.
Yeah, I think the most important thing about the New Deal is that it showed us that we don't have to, for me anyways, we always say that progress is going to take a long time and we may have to wait decades and everything else. And here you have a time span of a few, like 5 or 6 years. I mean, the New Deal was rolled out over a number of different years, but the main push came from the Great Depression, where you literally have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people just out in the streets because they don't have basic quality of life that they demand as American citizens. And that put a tremendous amount of pressure on Roosevelt. And he was, you know, a part of the banking community. He wasn't, you know, a middle-class guy. And he looked around and he said, okay, if we don't do something, this is going to boil over to the point where we're not going to be able to sustain the capitalist society that we have now. Yeah. And it was a lot of organizing with the socialists and within the communist parties and the labor unions in this country that really pushed for rapid change. And that change was, you know, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, basic qualities that every American is entitled to in order to live a certain standard and a quality of life that we expect as Americans.
So we, in fact, did become basically, in a lot of respects, a socialist country.
I wouldn't go as far as to say we were socialists, but democratic socialism.
Democratic socialism. We had Social Security. We had a lot of very important programs which served us and continue to serve us quite well. Social Security, Medicare, all these great things that have come about that are progressive policies, and who would say they're against those policies? Well, if you're against Social Security, well, if you're for Social Security, then in a sense you are socialist in your views to a degree. So you know, when Bernie came out and he said I'm a democratic socialist, I mean, you know, I'm thinking, you know, the complaint was, oh, everybody's going to say he's a socialist. But you know what? I asked good friends of mine, and a lot of them are to the right of center. I asked them, well, are you a socialist or are you an anti-socialist? And they thought, and they said, well, I guess in that sense, I'm a socialist. And what the heck's wrong with socialism? I mean, there's a lot of good in it. Continue on with the discussion about Roosevelt and what he did.
So, like I said, it was a period of rapid change with the Great Depression and the New Deal, and it was incredibly popular. And you see the Democratic Party rise really quickly because you're actually returning to the people benefits of their taxes.
Yeah.
And so the party became really strong after that. And over the decades after the New Deal, you see the New Deal get eroded, like throughout, all the regulations on the banks.
Yeah, it did, but actually up until even to Republican Dwight Eisenhower, we had some very strong socialist tendencies in the country. We had the top tax rate. People have to correct me in the audience.
92%.
Yeah, it was like 80 or 90%, and of course
92.
people had write-offs, so people didn't pay that much generally. But rich people paid a lot of taxes, and they understood that it was living in this great country that had made them wealthy, and they didn't mind giving some of that money back.
Right. And it's important to note that top tax rate, I believe it was 92%. It's not 92% on all of their income. It was income over a certain value, so that they were, they were incredibly wealthy. They were certainly still a part of, the highest class there is.
They had to be extremely wealthy.
And then it was every dollar over a specific number. And that money was then being recirculated so that people, we don't have this, what we've seen, especially since 1980 with Reaganomics, we don't see all this money just piling and being concentrated at the top. And then all the rest of us are just fighting for crumbs and scraps.
We didn't have deficits either. I mean, it was Reagan that brought us the first huge deficits with his tax breaks for the wealthy, and then of course later on George W. Bush, tax breaks for the wealthy, and now this president wants to follow through with the same thing on steroids, essentially. And draining the Treasury, and who gets hurt when you drain the Treasury? But middle class.
And they're laying the groundwork to steal from the middle class again by saying, well, we're in so much debt that we can't afford Social Security and we can't afford all this. And they call it starving the beast. I mean, there's a name for it. They've been doing this since the 80s.
Well, if we're the beast, if we as...
No, the government's the beast.
Oh, really? Well,
is what they're referring to.
Well, the last time I looked, the government represents us. It's it's our government.
Exactly. Well, they refer to it as starving the beast, being that they, conservatives hate the government, and so they're going to starve it so that they can say, oh, now we have to pull all these different social programs away from people in order to pay for the giant deficit that they themselves created. So they starve it so that they can kill it, essentially.
Yeah.
And
Grover Norquist, famous quote. Grover Norquist talked about reducing the government to the size where you could drown it in a bathtub.
Sure.
And they did a pretty good job of that in New Orleans, I believe. They drowned the city of New Orleans because they weren't putting enough money in just to maintain the levees to protect the city of New Orleans.
Right. And so, going back to, can the Democratic Party be the vehicle for this progress that we're seeking? It becomes very hairy, because if you look at the past 20 years, especially the past 30 years since the 1980s, almost 40 years, that's scary.
I'll tell you.
It's the Democratic Party hasn't really done a good job of protecting the progress that we made during the Great Depression. In fact, they've been taking so much money from corporate donors that the Democratic Party at the top especially is handcuffed by this money.
Quick, we'll be back here tomorrow at noon 30, so we're going to continue this discussion. We're going to continue it now, but we're going to continue it again tomorrow at noon 30, and we have another interesting topic of discussion that we're going to add in. So continue on.
And so I think, I think that it's an absolute legitimate question, and I think we all need to really investigate it because the Democratic Party has not protected us, and it hasn't been protecting us. And maybe this is another, one of the topics we should talk about next time, but the Democratic Party from the top down is incredibly calcified. And the idea that we're going to go in and just take over the whole thing is not that easy. There are structures in place and specific rules that prevent the type of change that we seek. And so is it possible, and is the amount of effort that it would take to do it less effort than it would be to just start a third party?
Your kitty cat says someone is trying to call you.
Sorry.
Kitty says hurry up and answer.
He only gets one call per show. Sorry.
Oh.
Yes.
So, I don't think the Democratic Party has been doing a good job of this. And I don't know if the Democratic Party can be that vehicle, given what I've seen with the Democratic primary, with the Democratic convention, with the past election, and with their current refusal to even look at themselves and assess and do an autopsy of what happened in 2016.
Well, I think we have the mirror to hold up in front of them and show them. And I have to believe that we can turn the Democratic Party back to what it once was. We're going to come back and talk about that tomorrow. This is Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Nina Sherwood and I are going to come back tomorrow, Thursday at noon 30. We're going to continue with that, and we have another topic to discuss in addition to that. Thank you for joining us, and we shall see you tomorrow, noon 30. Enjoy your evening.